Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Newseum's Walter and Leonore Annenberg Theater. I'm Jan Newharth, Chair and Chief Executive Officer of the Freedom Forum. Before I welcome tonight's guests, I would like to thank our Newseum members and friends of the First Amendment Society who are here tonight, whose continued support makes programs like this one tonight possible. I'm sure many of you have heard that we've entered into an agreement to sell this building to Johns Hopkins University. The Newseum will remain open at this location through 2019. And be assured, the Newseum is a mission with the building, not the other way around. So as the search for our new physical space begins, we remain committed to our mission and to continuing to host engaging programs like this one tonight to champion a free and fair press and our First Amendment freedoms. We appreciate all your messages of support as our mission moves forward. We're so pleased tonight to be joined by Jill Abramson, the former executive editor of the New York Times and author of the new book, Merchants of Truth, The Business of News and the Fight for Facts. The book follows 4 companies, the New York Times, the Washington Post, BuzzFeed and Vice Media, over a decade of disruption as they plow through a revolution in technology, economics, standards, commitment, and endurance. Abramson raises crucial questions that concern the well-being of our society as our nation faces a crisis in trust that threatens a free press. Nicholas Thompson writes, quite colorfully in his review in the New York Times, that the book is an audit of an industry that has spent much of the past decade wetting its pants in fear of digital technology and then worrying about whether to go to the dry cleaners. And it's a damn good read. And lest you think the New York Times might be biased reviewing a book by its former executive editor, Anne-Marie Lipinski, in her review in the Washington Post, writes that the book represents a distinctly ambitious effort to synthesize a period of dramatic upheaval and help us understand how key industry actors have shaped our information diet. To be sure, since the release of the book, there have been some questions raised about sourcing and attribution, and we look forward to hearing more from Jill tonight about those issues. We hope you've had a chance to purchase your copy of the book on your way in, but if not, the Newseum store will remain open after tonight's program, and Jill will be signing books afterwards in the Newseum's New York Times Great Hall of News on level 1. We're in good hands tonight with our moderator, Brian Stelter, CNN's chief media correspondent and host of Reliable Sources. Brian makes a return appearance just a week after leading a fascinating discussion here at the Newseum on the importance of a free press. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to welcome Brian Stelter and Jill Abramson.
This will be a little bit like a live edition of my program, Reliable Sources, but without commercial breaks, without any interruptions, which is wonderful. And Jill, we worked together 5 years ago when I was at the Times and then headed over to CNN. And I've been trying this TV gig, we'll see if it works out. But we were just watching CNN backstage, and I thought I would start with, the latest breaking news. Every day it's something. Today, this afternoon, this evening, the last couple minutes, it's Paul Manafort really did lie. He's broken his deal with the special counsel. His plea agreement's off. And it just made me wonder, what was it like to try to write a book about the news business in this period of an incredibly intense news cycle?
And tumult.
Tumult.
And of course, last night we had Paul Manafort and the cigar bar. What could be more delicious than that? Well, for me, it obviously was difficult to keep up with everything, but I really loved the fact that it was changing every week, it seemed. And when I started writing the book, I thought the story I was telling was that, the legacy media characters, the Times and the Post, were still like, not home free. They were struggling financially still. And, it looked like these shiny new digital upstarts in news, Vice and BuzzFeed, they'd built, such huge audiences. They were getting zillions of clicks. And, I know from, the period of time I was executive editor of the Times, we were envious of them. They looked like they had figured out something that we hadn't. And then everything changed and the story turned completely upside down. And of course, some of you who follow, news media news probably know, BuzzFeed and Vice both laid off 250 employees. That's a big cut. And, they're struggling. And the irony of their struggle is that the very platforms that enabled them to get big and succeed, Google and Facebook, are now the agents of their decline. And so keeping up was hard, but it was so fascinating and kind of such a challenge to, get as much of what was happening up to like when my book went into both galleys. After galleys, I was making changes.
And you focus on the Times, the Washington Post, BuzzFeed, and Vice. We'll talk about, I think, hopefully all four of them and what's happening in all four of them. But how did you decide when to finish? How did you decide when to stop telling their stories?
The story begins in 2007, which obviously is not, the dawn of the internet age, but it's when Facebook's news feed started, and it's when the iPhone was introduced, and Twitter started, and what I think of as like web at least 3.0, which is the age of social media that changed how information is shared and spread. So that's my beginning, and then I figured it was neat to just do a decade.
Yeah.
So it goes to the end of 2017, but I crammed in some 2018 developments too.
Right. Now it was, of course, the rise of social media that has enabled the audience to be the publishers, right? For anybody to be a publisher, for anybody to try to report news. And what we saw when your book came out were a number of people on social media accusing you of plagiarism, saying you took their words without credit. To our people who are here who have not seen my interview with Jill on Sunday, it's on CNN.com. We went into it in great depth. But what do you want people to know about those charges of plagiarism?
What I want them to know is that, I'm a perfectionist, and, it kills me that there's even one error and, a couple of bad citations. My book has 835 footnotes where, I credit most of the sources that I'm accused of stealing work from. And that doesn't quite make sense. I wish there are 835. I wish there were 6 more, obviously. But this was completely unintentional. It was sloppy. I'm, so sorry for it. I've tried to contact or call all of the reporters whose work, isn't properly cited. And most important of all, I've corrected everything. I've been transparent. I've said I own these mistakes, and I have corrected them all. And I'm really sad that this is somehow really marred like the rollout of my book. But I'm hoping the substance of my book will be unaffected, and as Jan said, it's gotten tremendous reviews, and it's an interesting and fun read.
Do you think there's something that the scrutiny tells us about the digital world? Something about the scrutiny you've come under that that tells us about this news environment?
I mean, and it's something that I write about at great length in the BuzzFeed chapters. I mean, it's so easy for something to go viral and, to be the subject of a tweet storm. Maybe I have been and I just wasn't aware of it. But
happily, blissfully unaware.
Like this, but, I could not read it. And my daughter, who, is sort of my soulmate and protector, she said, I'm going to read it all, and if you need to know something, I'll tell you. But she said to me, really don't look at it, that it has horrible things about your looks, your voice, and even some people criticizing my marriage. She said, your marriage to daddy. I'm trying to think, what could that be? We've, been married for almost 40 years.
I didn't notice anything about that in the book, actually.
No, but so, it's unpleasant. You can, the odd thing about Twitter, and again, I'm not trying to minimize these errors at all, I own them, but it can feel like everybody in the universe is screaming at you. When, the people who are on Twitter, it has a big following among our colleagues and journalists, but, most people I encounter have no idea what this is all about.
Where does your title come from? Merchants of Truth. What are you saying there?
Well, it comes from the fact that all of these 4 companies are challenged financially. There's no one business model that is going to let what I define as quality news organizations survive for the long term. And so all of them have had to become much more mercantile and much more inventive about finding every which way to bring in new revenue. And that means, things that were verboten at the New York Times for, you remember Al Siegel, surely.
Yes.
We had this fantastic senior editor who was kind of the ethics czar. But, he was of the newspaper era.
And those changes were uncomfortable for you as a...
They were still very uncomfortable for me. Things like, paid conferences that had sponsors, paying tens of thousands of dollars to have, their logo emblazoned. And they were companies that the Times covered. That just felt like not right to me. But, Bill Keller, who was my predecessor as executive editor, said something true, that all of these things, kind of where you get to in deciding which ones to fight and which ones to just say, okay, he says it always gets down to you either do this or the Baghdad Bureau is going to close. And it's tough. And, I say in the book that, maybe my ethical compass and the strictures that I see should be in place to not, I don't like native branded advertising. I think it can confuse readers. So, the merchants is, they're selling stuff. I mean, the New York Times, is selling, what is it called? It's a kind of commerce, something. But BuzzFeed sells a line of cookware in department stores because, I don't know, do any of you watch their tasty videos? It's shot from above and it's hands making something fairly simple. That's, they're all, selling.
They're all well, and you say in the book that Keller was not a fan of the business side. Were you not a fan of the business side of the Times?
I really respected a lot of people that were on the business side, and I was managing editor for 8 years and worked very closely with all of them, and had battles even back then. I didn't want to do a second style section, which was pushed by the advertising department because they were losing all these categories of advertising, and style, luxury goods was doing pretty good. So, I bowed to that, but, not without putting up, a fight and making myself seem difficult.
So,
I'll let you, take over. But probably the most important part of the merchants is journalists now build themselves as individual brands. It used to always be, Jill Abramson of the Wall Street Journal or of the New York Times. And because, Facebook, 63% of American adults get their news on their news feeds just as individual articles, they kind of have to be, because that disaggregated the package that we all are familiar with.
There was some tension between you and me over the years about the brand.
Right, you're a brand.
When I was there,
you've been so successful.
A little tension, that's okay. I left in 2013, you left in 2014. We're both outside the Times now. Now we both report on the New York Times. What I'm wondering is, what did you learn as a reporter looking into the Times? What did you find for this book? What did you learn?
Well, what I learned is that, the Times has, and I knew this when I worked there, it has such a strong culture. And the culture completely changed during the years that I'm covering in this book and that I reported on. And I don't really think that I fully appreciated how traumatic that was for a large part of what was, the newspaper journalists who were having to switch over, and that, I sort of led the effort to unify the newsroom and not have a separate web newsroom and print newsroom. But I didn't appreciate in real time how that hurt to a lot of my colleagues. So that was something I learned.
Would we even recognize the place now? Has it changed that much?
No, and I don't recognize a lot of the bylines when I'm reading, even on the homepage, and that's good. It was a problem when I was managing editor and executive editor that the newsroom had, a high median age. I mean, no one leaves the Times, so so it was. Someone had to either retire or, there wasn't money to bring in a lot of new digital talent. Now, thank goodness there is.
And that's partly because of the Trump bump, a rise in subscriptions thanks to interest in President Trump or horror about President Trump. You've been criticized, including on my show, for saying the paper's tone was anti-Trump, or is anti-Trump. So what do you mean by anti-Trump?
Well, I just think the sheer number of different stories, and it's true in the Post too.
Yeah, you call out the Washington Post for this also.
Yeah, and it's just, there are so many different Trump stories every day. And, he is sort of the master manipulator. He loves, being the reality TV star turned president. He knows exactly how to dominate a news cycle. And, most of the pieces are either about the Mueller probe or about some idiotic tweet, he wrote, or, it's sometimes, on the one of the Washington Post apps, which mixes opinion and news as you scroll.
Yeah.
It's sometimes, more than 2 screens before I get to anything that isn't Trump.
So let's make you the new editor of the Washington Post. What do you do differently?
I make, and I think Marty has done a great job. I actually think he has started to, change it up a bit. And you do fabulous investigative reporting. I think the quality of the deep sort of, it's almost like the return of the muckrakers period, which I actually love. I love the Times's investigation of how Trump got wealthy and of how the family evaded the gift taxes. Right. But It's just that sometimes there are subsidiary stories that I think, don't need to be there. Headlines that almost gratuitously put Trump in them. Like there's a story about something happening in New York a week ago, but the headline led with, "In a rebuke to Trump, comma, blah, blah, blah." And, why I love
Trump's a front
the
door of a lot of
buck-breaking
things,
type
right?
thing is that isn't reactive. That's enterprise. And, I think both news organizations, and I think this is true of BuzzFeed too, have gotten bolder in a good way. Because Lord knows, I should say, I'm like one of the biggest critics of Trump. But, I just think you have to calibrate it in a slightly different way, and that's beginning, I think, to happen.
And you definitely praise the New York Times and the Washington Post at length throughout the chapters. You also said something about the Post, turning to the Post that I wanted to bring up. You said the Post, with so many headlines, so many viral stories, risked cheapening its brand with all the silly stuff and losing traditional readers. What do you think that tension is at the Post? Because they've leaned a lot more into quantity of content than the New York Times
Clickbait,
has.
yeah.
I don't know if I'd call it that, but yeah.
And, some of the...
But I do click a lot of it. So.
The stories are, hilarious, but what caught my eye is the way the headlines for those stories are written. It's exactly like BuzzFeed. It's like, and you can't imagine what happened next. Like, you've got to click on that. And, I don't know that they've lost their traditional readership because main news is great, but as I'm scrolling, I definitely see one or two of those.
Right.
Woman, killed her son in some bizarre way, and you won't believe what happened.
What happened next? Yeah, you call it a strange stew at the Post.
It is a little
strange
bit,
stew.
especially on the apps.
And yet, their enterprise reporting, right, has been
Fantastic. And I think, what is clickbait and why would a fantastic news organization like the Washington Post include it? Because scale matters. And those stories, just like the Trump stories, get tons of clicks. And if you have a big audience and tons of clicks, even though advertising has become a less important revenue source, you get advertising. So, on the merchant's part, that's part of it too. There's a financial incentive to have those kinds of stories. I mean, just to bring BuzzFeed into it, I mean, their biggest story ever was, just a question about a dress, where they showed the picture, and the question was, is this dress blue and black or white and gold? And people saw it differently. It was some kind of optical illusion, and 26 million people clicked on that story. And of course, the phenomenon of that story was covered by the Times and the Post.
Right. One more thing about the Post. The owner has been in the news lately. Jeff Bezos. How has he done?
How has he done?
As the owner of the Post. Yeah.
He has been the kind of owner that Don Graham and Bob Woodward and some of the other elders of the Post, they did a lot of due diligence before even speaking to Jeff Bezos. And, the obvious thing on their minds was, is he going to interfere or try to use the Post as an instrument to help Amazon, which is, of course, what President Trump has ridiculously called it, the Amazon Washington Post. I mean, Jeff Bezos bought it with his personal money as a personal purchase, and the $250 million price tag was like pennies to him. But he promised he would not interfere, and I don't know of him like even inquiring about a story before it was published.
Yeah.
And that's so important. And it's interesting, I tell this story in the book, that when he was first called by a financial intermediary of the Grahams, he said, like, he wasn't interested and said, what do I know about the newspaper business? But he realized that, and this is a story that I tried to tell, that it's really also a technology business now, which he's the greatest at.
So is that where we're going to end up? Just a bunch of billionaires and families owning papers?
Well,
back to the old
they're
days?
owning, right now, quite a few of them. And, in the case of the LA Times, it looks hopeful. They've been able to bring back their quality. I mean, the Post really its quality had suffered in the last years of the Graham regime, despite all their efforts to save it. I think the newsroom was down to maybe 600 reporters. The Times, newsroom, when at the point I was fired, was like 1,250 journalists. So, and good media commentators like Jim Fallows were writing that the quality was not what it was, but it sure has come back, and what Bezos promised, is his exact words were, I'm going to give you the runway. He's going to fund the runway, but they had to take off. And they
have
did.
now. Profitable now, yeah. I think one of the most important stories I ever wrote for your New York Times was this 300-word little story inside the business section that said, BuzzFeed hires Ben Smith to create a news division. And none of us knew that was going to be a big deal, and none of us knew it was going to become what it is today. Now, of course, we're all wondering if that BuzzFeed story is true about Trump and Cohen. Still a mystery. But what did you learn about BuzzFeed when you sank your teeth in?
Well, they have a very different attitude about what should be published. And that doesn't mean, they're publishing lewd things necessarily, but they feel if everyone in the news media knows about something like the Steele dossier, and when, both outgoing President Obama and incoming President Trump had been briefed on the Steele dossier by the FBI, they alone just published the thing. They did do a companion story saying some of the material in it was unverified, but their attitude is that editors aren't the gatekeepers they once were, and that let readers decide what information they want or don't. And they only started doing news in 2012 when you wrote that story, and they have a 20-journalist investigative unit now. So they do these tasty videos, and they were a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize last year in international reporting for an investigation they did of Russian oligarchs being murdered in London.
Is there any difference between tasty videos and investigations versus the style section of the Times and the front page of the Times? Is it the same model?
No, and it's not at all the same model. And the Times now, especially because digital subscribers have become a really important source of revenue for them, they want you, the Times wants you to get your news from the New York Times and pay for it, and to travel all over the site or the app and really get your news there, and they care about their homepage. It's sort of a Facebook strategy. Facebook doesn't want you to ever leave Facebook. That's its guiding principle, and that the Times, wants you to believe, and I think it's true, that they're the best news source. So why would you go anywhere else? But the BuzzFeed model, and this was Jonah Peretti, the founder of it, he had this vision that BuzzFeed News would succeed by using what he called a distributive model, where you just pushed out every story on as many platforms, even Pinterest, as you could, and get as many readers as you could, and that was going to be the path to success. I was actually in their newsroom when he explained that to everybody.
They say the recent cuts are about becoming sustainable and not having to bet so intensely on venture capital funding. Do you have a bet yourself on what happens to BuzzFeed?
Well, you know, I think their future is dicey. And, you know, Peretti floated a trial balloon in the New York Times not long ago that maybe all of these new digital upstart news companies that looked so promising that maybe they should all merge.
Get in a life raft and row together.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Now, what about Vice? You describe Vice in its early years. It's, you know.
It was a lad mag.
It was a
yeah. Lad mag.
There's this scene where you say, describing how Vice goes out and goes into the field with gonzo journalism all around the world. It was a miracle no one died, several producers told me. I think that kind of summed up a version of Vice, like one era of Vice.
Yeah.
Yeah. What?
Their style, I mean, when they pitched to HBO doing their weekly show,
Yeah.
they said it was 60 Minutes meets Jackass,
And
which
you
is
found that they weren't
you know,
focused-
incredibly popular for those of you who don't know, like skateboarding,
Stunts.
kind of, okay,
idiocy.
right.
You say they weren't focused on standards. Did they ever get focused on standards?
Yeah,
Did
they
Vice grow
did.
up?
You know, like everything in life, you know, it took a bad occurrence to sort of make them get sued. They didn't even have an ethics policy in the beginning for their journalists. But Ben Smith made an unwise decision to scrub out of reality, to just, you know, get off the internet some, you know, stories they had done.
Wait, Ben Smith or Shane Smith? There's two Smiths. You mean Vice? Shane Smith?
No.
Oh, Ben Smith at BuzzFeed.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Oh, BuzzFeed.
Oh, I'm sorry. We're on Vice. When did
No,
they?
but BuzzFeed did erase some stories off the web.
And then
they
got
BuzzFeed had to clean up its
serious.
act. Right.
Right. But
Right.
But you know, like
forgot about that.
it's sort of the founders who were very young in the beginning, Shane Smith
Yeah.
and Jonah Peretti. They kind of grew up and got more serious. And you know, Vice's style, you know, where Jackass met 60 Minutes washed out in the end, is they do stories in a different way. And, you know, I think they do a lot of high quality stories, but they call their style immersive. And what that means is you are there with the correspondent in some godforsaken or dangerous place. And there is, you know, almost no stand-up, no correspondent with a microphone explaining the story to you. You're just kind of living it. And that's, you know, very, very different than, you know, certainly the nightly news broadcasts or cable or anything like that. And so they, you know, in terms of video, what was Shane Smith's brilliant, you know, decision was, and it came in a funny way, was he saw that video was going to be tremendously profitable and an important way to convey news and information and, you know, entertaining content that people would want to watch on their computer screens and on their phones. And they started doing, they created a channel that became many channels on YouTube, which of course was bought by Google. Very early, like in 2008, but the way he jumped into video is that one of his best friends is the movie director Spike Jonze, who directed and being John Malkovich and a bunch of other good movies. And Spike was sort of their creative consultant. And he was at lunch with Shane Smith and loved the magazine. Vice started as a magazine. Not that serious in the beginning, but it started doing like sort of great travelogue, deep stories that he loved. And he looked at Shane and said, of course you're sending a videographer out with the reporter. And Shane, whose nickname is Bullshitter Shane, like just looked at his friend Spike and said, oh yeah, of course. And then he went running back to the Brooklyn headquarters and ordered video equipment. And from that point on, they were big into video.
In the video business. Shane's story doesn't necessarily end very well. He's no longer CEO. The Me Too movement exposed some embarrassment at Vice.
Not on him.
Not on him, but on others. But now Nancy Dubuque is running Vice. And, same question as BuzzFeed. What happens to Vice?
I think it's very tough for them. I think they'll be around for a while, but I understand some of the late moves that Shane Smith made. On your cable systems, I think there's a station, Viceland. Maybe you don't watch it, but
I have to admit I've never watched, but it is there.
Viceland used to be the History Channel 2,
right.
Which was World War II all the time. And unfortunately, the original programming on Viceland gets lower ratings than History Channel 2 did.
Yeah, I was a little worried when Viceland launched, but I'm not really worried anymore.
It's kind of
competition.
A dud. Although I like some of the shows, kind of nutty that I do, but I do. So they have. I hope they survive because I like that they have kind of they're bringing a freshness to the nightly news. They have a very young, very diverse group of correspondents. They use a lot of graphics. They cover stories well that you definitely don't see on the networks. They did like a fabulous story about trans kids and the difficult decisions they and their parents have to make about hormone shots and that kind of thing. And they are very plugged into the interests of a younger audience. And there are no blow-dried, stentorian tone correspondents, on their shows.
Yeah, they owned a story like Charlottesville with Elle Reeve there
I
in the thick of it.
Right.
I'm
sad because, can I just do an aside?
Yeah.
I'm sad that all of the Twitter criticisms and other things have been from Vice.
Right, it was a Vice reporter who came out.
Right, and they think, I don't know, you tell me honestly whether you think, they thought my portrayal of them was like saying that they weren't serious, that they only had their jobs because they were young and diverse and had a different look, and that I was kind of turning my nose up at them. And I really did not intend to do that.
I think any author who looks at Vice and while also looking at the New York Times and Washington Post is not going to meet Vice.
Okay, so I had old media, old fogey.
No, I'm saying that when you talk about all of them together, you have to show the contrast.
Right.
And Vice is a dramatic contrast to what we think of as standard traditional journalism.
But I think
I like
that's
some of what they
made
do, and I'm horrified by some of
everybody
what they do.
mad.
Yeah.
Like, and Thomas Morton is one of the people. He's a big character in the middle Vice chapter, and his nickname is Baby Balls. But he's a good he from being an intern at the magazine, has his own show now on Viceland, and he is like a very good correspondent. But I think he thinks I was somehow making fun of him. And
Can't please them all.
oh, no, you definitely can.
I tried to poach a couple
and I
of
didn't
Vice
set
reporters,
out to please these 4 places. I mean, I'm pretty skeptical about all of them in places.
And deservedly so. All of them are going through this radical change. To our audience, we're going to take questions in a couple of minutes. We have microphones over here and over here. We'll take your questions. But just one more, Jill, for me, and that is, what's your favorite story being inside these newsrooms? What was the most interesting or kind of crazy thing that happened when you were interviewing folks in these newsrooms? I have a feeling Vice might be the craziest, but maybe not. Maybe it's...
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the craziest thing there that I saw.
But they were cleaning up their act when you were working on it.
Very much so. The most interesting thing that felt crazy to me is, I didn't get to interview Shane Smith until the bitter end. I'd done so much work on him, and he's a big burly guy and, very colorful character, to say the least. So I went out to lunch with him, and it was interesting. He's smart. He's famous for being like one of the great marketers of all time, but also for, not always sticking to the facts. And
Yes.
he told me something that I knew from my reporting wasn't true, which is Vice hoped at a point, when it was still doing well and had still, a ridiculous valuation of like $4 billion, they wanted to be acquired by Disney.
Right.
And I knew that Disney had taken a look at their books and, had not wanted to go forward with the deal. And he looked at me and he said, I turned down Disney. And it just, was funny. Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask you next about, we're talking about real news and real newsrooms, but where does misinformation and lying and information warfare and this, this environment we all feel like we're living in where you don't know what is true, where do you see that playing in this conversation about
I worry about that, and that's the business of facts part of my subtitle. Yeah. Because, it's a cliche to say the speed of the web, but you all do now expect to know what happened, like when it happened, like in real time. And, when something like, the Boston Marathon bombing happens, it's like a rush to it. Or, the Supreme Court decision on Obamacare. And everyone wants to, especially, get on CNN like right away, and they don't have the time to call the legal sources and make sure everything is right. So towards the end of my tenure there, I was like rushing into the newsroom more to guard against the night editors, because it's thinly staffed, and God forbid, like seeing a story on the web and just putting it on our site. And for Obamacare, I had to say no one would put up a story until the Supreme Court reporter had told the Washington bureau chief he had it right. And the bureau chief called me. Because, that is how misinformation, it's not a bad intention, but, after the marathon bombing, a wrong suspect was identified on the web, and the fact that, arrests had been made was reported, wrongly, and, it's great that news can, come to you on those breaking news alerts. But, the dark side of that is, bad stories. And at this point, with the president calling us enemies of the people and fake news, and reporter got beaten up at his El Paso rally, and I think that's going to happen more unless he kind of cools it. But what worries any wrong story in a good publication, he just loves that, because it drives down trust and it makes him look like he's right, and that kills me.
Like he's the victim. What are the odds you think that he'll cool down his rhetoric? Is there a number smaller than 0?
There isn't, but I would pick that number if it did exist.
If it did exist.
Because, the thing is, he learned everything about how he, quote unquote, leads from The Apprentice. And he knows better than anyone. He is running this presidency like it's a juicy story. And, there has to be a new installment. Tune in tomorrow for the next crazy thing that Donald Trump does. And, it's just gonna be that way. And every story needs what? A great villain. And he's decided we're the great villain. We are.
And what do you tell your students at Harvard about how to adjust to this period? I wonder if some of them fear going into journalism because they hear about the photographer getting roughed up at the rally, and they think no one's going to trust them.
I don't think that causes fear. It definitely causes their parents fear.
Right, that's good. That's the difference.
They were fearful to begin with that their Harvard, child would, be destined for poverty in the first place, and then that it's now a very dangerous line of work. But I teach at one of the seminars I teach is journalism in the age of Trump, and not all my students want to go into journalism. They're just fascinated by the news and what's happening, and I try to get them totally news literate. I teach a whole class on, stories that went wrong. I am trying to show them what they're doing this week is they're analyzing the president's tweets. I have them, they have to write about 3 of them and look at the news stories that were triggered by them and sort of write an opinion editorial about whether the news media is too reactive to him. It's fun. I kind of make up each class like every week. And of course, we talked this week about the Bezos piece in Medium. And
what do you think happened with Bezos and the Inquirer?
I think, they blackmailed him. And I think someone's going to jail.
Right, we don't know the end of the story. All right, again, we'd love your questions on either microphone. Let's start right over here.
Hi, all of the agencies that you're covering all have a national boundary. And I was wondering, is there a future to local news types? And is national the boundary, or is there actually international news sources that are going to come out of the internet age?
I mean, definitely, I'll take international first, and you do it too, Brian, but absolutely yes. And The Guardian, where I write a political column, is an example of, they have a very different business model, but they're going to survive, and, they, exist as an international website, much more than a newspaper. Local news, tough. Hundreds of papers have shuttered. Others have been taken over by vulture capital funds that strip them down for parts. And unfortunately, one of the worst ones, Alden Capital, based in New York, is mounting a hostile takeover for the Gannett papers, which are mostly regional papers that have suffered in the past couple of years. The advertising base has just, gone away totally. And, there isn't a good model for local news. Some local TV stations that are in a good, profitable chain are in okay shape, but, that adds the disappearance of local newspapers, I think, adds to the huge distress numbers that the media has generally, because the local newspaper, people are there, it's closest to the community it covers. The people in the locality, they may know the publisher, the editor, the reporter, and it's news that matters in their lives directly. And so it's, it's a bad thing for the fabric of democracy that they've gone away. And, in their place, a lot of fabulous digital, newsrooms have tried to fill that vacuum. There's, the Texas Tribune and the Min Post. There are a lot of them, and I don't feel Pollyannish like they're gonna grow and soon make us not miss the local newspapers. So I'm optimistic about the survival of quality journalism in general, but I feel pretty grim about local news.
I wish some of those Vice investors would put some of that money into Cincinnati and Omaha and not just into the Vices, but it's just me. Let's go over here.
Hello.
Hi.
I have a question for both of you. You kind of touched on it a little bit near the end, and you'll probably hate the question, but it's very relevant right now. I worked for American Media for 7 years.
Fantastic.
Well,
Can we interview you?
From 2006 to 2013, I
Great.
specifically had a column in the Inquirer, a weekly column.
Yeah.
And I left in 2013, thankfully, because they seem to have gone off the deep end even more over the past couple years. But lately, what's been going on with them is very alarming to even me, who I still know all the guys who also left there, like Jerry George was the one who hired me, who's been on your network a lot
Yes.
over the past couple weeks. So my question is, what do you think is happening with the tabloid news? And do you think that they're getting into dangerous territory by what they're doing now?
Well,
'Cause it's
AMI
pretty scary.
certainly is. And, I think the most troubling thing that's come out isn't even the Bezos extortion, but is that
Saudi.
crazy Saudi Arabia, puff issue that came out of nowhere and is so unlike, anything they publish. And what is that all about? And,
Money.
Saudi money has come up, in the Mueller investigation, and, Pecker is so close to President Trump. I mean, that's the part that intrigues me, but I want to know what your column was about.
No, that's funny. But our column, actually, we got hired, me, my sister, and a friend of ours were hired. They basically wanted to make the magazine younger in like 2006, 2007.
So you were the voice of youth.
They hired us on because they're like, we need new young people stories. People are getting tired of like Stedman and Oprah and stuff like that. Like they seriously said that to us. And so
Or
within,
Hillary is dying.
yes, exactly. Like aliens are coming down. So they hired us, and within 2 weeks of working for them, we gave them so much stuff. But our column was very fun. It was called, in the beginning, Behind the Velvet Ropes. Then it was Hollywood After Dark. And we were known within the company as the Inquirer Angels, because we would always send them scoop. But our column was very fun. It was more like, ooh, Leonardo DiCaprio, we caught you with two
Brian.
models, you know, like just funny
Brian,
stuff.
what do you think about tabloid news?
Well, I've heard a lot of
these days?
staffers from your era of the Inquirer say they barely recognize it now because it has changed.
It's scary when you look at it. Like ours was more fun, and we did make it younger. And what's funny is, in 7 years I worked there, we only had to retract something one time. One time we got in trouble, and it was true, but we still had to do it because we didn't
Well, I
want the
wonder if
legal-
it's about politics that got too infected into the magazine.
Well, during
right?
the
Into
John Edwards, I was around during the John Edwards time.
Oh, great
They sent
scoop.
us to the Hilton. We were there walking unnoticed, you know. But around that time, they were thinking of having like a Washington bureau and really getting into it. And
wasn't
then they
the
moved
National
away.
Enquirer Jennifer Flowers too for Clinton?
Well, look, there's always been a market for sensational and entertaining and news that pushes that envelope. And what is gossip and news? I was upstairs earlier going to the history exhibit here, and you see that in the 1800s, right? Just as you see it today. I think the difference now in this moment is that political nature of
Yeah,
what happened to the
that's new.
Inquirer. Let's go to just one more question behind you before we run out of time up here. And then I would like to talk to you after.
Yeah.
I could talk to you all night about my.
Great, good.
Hi. So back in the 2016 election, I looked at on the Facebook side of my friend, conservative friend, and he said, "Why isn't the Washington Post talking about this?" And it was a Facebook post about how Mrs. Clinton was running some kind of trafficking ring.
Death cult, child sex ring.
Exactly.
And you name
So,
it. It's like
so
Mad
now,
Libs.
now fast forward, and everyone is kind of saying, well, Putin and the Macedonians or whoever on Facebook were trying to engineer Brexit,
That was a BuzzFeed scoop.
and they were trying to get Mrs. Clinton defeated. But usually, at a higher level, when politicians and so on talk about this, they end up by saying, but probably they were trying to do that, but it probably didn't work. It probably didn't really have a game-changing influence. But what do you think? Do you think that the Facebook Putin-Macedonian thing was a game changer?
Did the Russian interference
Yeah.
change the
Did it
outcome of the
work?
election? Just an easy question for you to wrap up on, Jill.
Well, you know, I found Kathleen Hall Jameson, who's like a great political scientist, has written a new book about, you know, the fake news during the 2016 campaign. And she's looked at all of these sites. And, you know, it's curious. I'm just going to, because we have little time, take one example of why. You know, I don't know, obviously, but why, like, I suspect it did affect the outcome of the election is because, you know, the turnout in both Michigan and Wisconsin, it went down in Pennsylvania too, but in Michigan, it's down like 12. Black turnout in Michigan was down 12%. I mean, okay, Obama wasn't on the ballot, but that's like a huge drop. And where did one of the fake sites on Facebook was called Blacktivist? And it was, you know, the Russian information agency.
Right.
They created these fake, they look like Black Lives Matter sites, and they had negative stories about Hillary.
They make you hate the Democrats.
You know? And you know, I think that's part of why African American turnout was so low in that state and took a dive. And you know, it was Michigan was one of the states that was razor thin.
Yeah.
And Milwaukee, the same thing.
You can't help but wonder. You can't help but. Kathleen's book is Cyber War, and it's very good on that. Okay, in a sentence, as we wrap up, why should we buy your book?
Because it's a juicy read and very important history, and you know, we both toil in a business that is central to our democracy, but is pretty fragile.
We have to work together to keep it alive and thriving. Yeah, Jill, thank you. Thank you very much. And most importantly, thank you to our audience. Thank you for being here and supporting the Newseum. Thank you.